All right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. Joined again by Mercy as we continue doing our discussions on origins. I just want to thank you, Mercy, for sticking it in there. We've gone like a month already, which is crazy when you think about it. 4 episodes, so one a week. So time goes by fast, and it feels like we really barely even scratched anything. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's so fun doing these podcasts with you, and I am really looking forward to the new year and what God has in store for everyone, and really for your channel too, and how you're going to be, explaining these kinds of concepts for people to comprehend and to understand.
Yeah, and it's fun too. As slow as it might be in some aspects, it's a lot to get the mind around, and that's what we've been kind of discussing. Is going from this picture of Adam being this first man in the middle of the forest by himself, however long ago, and then from him comes all the peoples of the world, and most people never ever get past that idea, and it's a very introductory idea. Like it's very very uh, modern reading as well at the same time. Like the average person, 3,500 years ago, is that how they would read it? So we are looking at it from a very uh, infants, in a look at very infancy, just quick, however we want to look at it, very non thoughtful, you know, interaction. I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's just when we gap that much time, it does seem that our conversations really haven't grown in any time. We're still in the infancy of that discussion. Like everything that you go back and look at with the early church fathers, they're still debating the same things that all the people today are debating. So, science may have come a long way in the discussion, and the counter arguments may have as well. But at the end of the day, it's still the very first topics. Like we haven't come out of this idea even being birthed. And so that's why to me this is so exciting, is because it seems like we finally hit a point where God has decided the gateways are opening. A lot of this is becoming available. And to me that's what's been so exciting, is we might not be, flying through different ideas and topics, but the weight of it is so important to me.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about Genesis, immediately people think about origins. Like they open up Genesis expecting, and I expected this too, but I was a child of, okay, where's the dinosaurs? How did it all start? And all of these concepts of origin story. But when you actually look at what God is putting together in Genesis, it's really their story, and how there's universal truths there that we can all glean from. But it is their story. And most evangelical Christians were never taught that. We were taught it's my story, right? And we can't personalize it until we've contextualized it first. And we haven't even gotten to that base. That's why it's like what you were just saying, like we're tiptoeing around because it's like we can't get that like pinned down, and that's what we're trying to do through these podcasts.
I think too that's what makes it so difficult of a conversation, is because it's been going on for so long and it really hasn't changed for so long that any deviation from the normalities become it's very shocking. Even if it isn't that shocking of an idea, just the deviation is shocking. Which brings us to the kind of summary of what we've been chatting to this point, and we'll do a quick refresher here with a nice kind of five, the reporter five, the who, what, when, where, and why, which we're going to take a look at to address what is it that the Bible is presenting to us as a context that we need to engage in with it. And so when we take a look at these things, we have the what is the Bible? Well, we've been able to, in the past conversations, go over the idea that this was started with Moses at the time period of the Exodus. Whether he put it all together, no, it's not the conversation, but that's the first message. That's the first big idea, is that the Bible was put together when Israel was being formed as a nation at their beginning, and the stories of Genesis coming forward was the history of how that came to be, which gives us our second understanding of, well, then why is Adam in there? Adam has a beginning as well, which his descendants lead into Israel. So we have the picture of Israel being created as a people, And the story of Adam is their legitimization. So it's, how can Israel just claim to be this great, powerful nation and this great, powerful God out of nowhere? They've never been anywhere before. Well, they're claiming they have been. They say that the first nation that God made a covenant with to rule over all of Mesopotamia, they are their descendants. So we get a nice picture to the what. What is the Bible talking about? It's talking about the creation of a people claiming the right to rule over the land of Mesopotamia through hereditary title, all the way back from the very first covenantal empire. So that helps us bring a big concept shift into the way we have to approach this. But we have to approach it this way because this isn't our world, this is their world. If they were to come and join us in our world today, they would have no concepts of the things that we look at. And I love John Walton's image of, if you take like a picture of the Earth and you show it to everyone in the Earth anywhere today, and we can all look at it, we understand, roughly everyone will understand what we're looking at. Whether we have our same agreements or not, it's unnecessary. We all can reflect in the meaning that's portrayed in it. However, if you were to take that exact same symbolism of our picture and bring someone from the time of Mesopotamia forward and show them the picture, they'd have no concept of what that image was. In fact, it would take you a long time, not only just to tell, you'd be like, well, this is the land. Like, yeah, okay, that's the land. Like, yeah, we're looking at it from space. I'm like, space? What is space? And so we take for granted that what we understand is what they understand. And so that's why these ideas are shocking. But to the original experiencing this, Israel at the time of their Exodus, it only makes sense according to the suzerain vassal contract in which that they were created under, which was to refresh that where they came from. So for what we are summarizing, what is the Bible talking about? What is it connecting to? The creation of Israel as a people at the time of the Bronze Age. When, or not when, but why? Because they were claiming hereditary title from Adam, the first empire. So that brings us from the first W, the what. And now I'll throw the next one over. So those the what, where. So we'll go where. Mercy, if you want to kind of lead us into a quick cover, where is this taking place? Where does the Bible take place? Because spoiler alert, all the way from Adam to Jesus, it's all in the same locale. So if
Right.
you could speak to that, especially on more, maybe even broader terms, take liberties on Earth, because so many people do. That would be a huge context that when we're talking about what land, that's a pretty big idea.
Yeah. I remember taking the Genesis class in my Bible school. That was one of the first classes that I took, and it was with our Hebrew professor. And in Genesis 2:10, it gives you the actual location. And just thinking back, this is in the early 90s. It's really amazing just to think back on that time frame, and even like how he would talk about it. It was almost presented to the class like it was unknown, and it was somewhere in like a heavenly domain, even though in the text itself it gives you the exact location. It gives you in the Tigris and Euphrates river between the waters. And before we even got the term Mesopotamia, we got that from the Greeks. Whoever is a conqueror, they get the opportunity, or they demand to name things. So they named it between the rivers, but before that it was Sumeria. That's what the people called it, was Sumeria. And in that location, if you understand that that was the geography and that was the kingdom of Eden, we go into that context, then you're understanding, oh my gosh, this is happening somewhere on planet Earth in this region of the ancient Near East. And there is something happening here with a birth of a nation or a kingdom, or an empire that is rising out of the dust or rising out of the peoples there. So that is the location specifically. And even when I first started to teach this at my house church, I had some people like, well, the Bible never says that. Nobody can find Eden. Nobody knows. I'm not talking about like we found, Eden and it's Eridu, the most ancient civilization there. They say that it is Eridu. Whether it is or not, that's not the point. We know that that is a locale and it was in Sumer, and you have these different people groups that are coming. So this is a whole body of Adam. It is all of Mesopotamia. And what you were saying before about Israel, what's interesting is that Israel is writing this to say we're the headship of Adam. But Adam has a whole body. He has arms and legs and all that. And we forget that in Genesis 10 when it talks about the 70 nations, that you have the sons of Noah and their sons, and they're making up the whole body of Adam. And we
Yeah,
totally
filled the whole earth,
earth, right?
which
And
was called Shinar.
yeah, Einar, Sumer. And when the Bible is saying the whole earth or the whole world, we have to understand in all the ancient Near Eastern literature, when they would talk about their world, um, it was their world. They never would have thought the whole globe or the whole planet or Mother Earth. They would have never thought that way in the first place. And that word Eretz in Hebrew is just talking about land, region, area. And then when it got translated into Latin and then into the English Bibles, we they put earth in there or world. Now, when you do that, you have created a problem, because now we're thinking in our context, in our modern context, oh, it was the whole world. And so immediately when you talk about Genesis and where Adam was, everyone is thinking, wow, this was the beginning of the whole world. And that's what we have to wean people out of. That word erects in Hebrew, in Genesis, and all throughout the Old Testament, what you're seeing is it's that regional place. And even today when you watch movies and stuff, like I was watching Last of the Mohegans, and she had never seen war before, and here's the French army and the English army and they're fighting, and she's never heard the bombs or anything. This is very new to her, and she just looks at the guy and she says, oh my gosh, our world is dying, it's on fire. She said that, but she's not saying the whole world. It was just that little region, right? It's the same thing when we talk about when, where is it? It is at that place. And then it is expanding as, Israel's history is evolving into becoming a nation.
Even when we compare it with how we use it, and we take it from these extremes of nations and make it this big macro issue, we constantly use it on a day-to-day basis for micro issues all the time. It's like, oh, the car isn't starting, my whole world's crumbling. Like, we use it all the time. It's like, so you're sitting there, you're doing your thing, and then your roommate or your spouse or someone comes in and they're in a bad mood and they kick things over and you're like, why are you coming here and wreck my whole world? Like, we use stuff all the time where it's like, you send someone a message of appreciation, and also they send it back. And you're like, I was having such a bad day that lightened up my whole world. And so we microcosm it all the time. But for some reason, when we want to macrocosm it, people start to question the validity of that speech. And that's where we've got to go, okay, that's just more imagery, and we'd actually still use it.
Absolutely.
And so that whole idea also of how big and how grandiose this is, we can compare a couple speech patterns with it as well, like to bring Earth into perspective. Egypt is referred to as the ends of the earth, the most remote places. And that's a very interesting description, because when we're in Genesis 2 and it talks about the borders, well, when we compare that to the story of Noah, no, to uh, Job, not Job, as if I forgot his name, Jonah. I went and put two of the guys together, Job and. Okay, so Jonah, you have Jonah who wants to not go all the way north, all the way up by Assyria, all the way up to Nineveh. He doesn't want to go all the way up there. So here we have these borders, which is almost as far north as the Middle East goes, which is up to Nineveh. And then we have Egypt, the far southeast or southwest. And there's this polar opposite between the two portions. And those are considered to be the bounds of the Mesopotamian area, which is quite interesting because when you read Genesis 2, that's the covenant territory that's outlined in Genesis chapter 2, the whole land, the whole bounds of Mesopotamia, the earth, the whole earth. that Adam filled, that Noah filled, that Israel filled, that Nebuchadnezzar filled. And so, where, and I'm just piggybacking off of what Mercy was talking about, where is the whole Bible taking place? Well, just like we said, the whole Bible is talking about one people in Mesopotamia and the covenant they established with God. Well, it's talking about the land in which they lived. That's the where. And it doesn't leave that area. Why would it? The people don't. The story doesn't.
Mm.
And so that helps put some roots to kind of what we're talking about. And all this information is highly available today. Well, that's what's so good about this is we're not necessarily in this conversation going to go in and show you all the source data, but the hope is in these conversations is to get you to say that's not true, or how can that be? Because as soon as you look it up, you'll find it out. And so hopefully this can be a catalyst to either help reinforce, make you think of new understandings, but get you to be part of the conversation. And I know you want to be. That's why we're having it and you're listening. And that's what's so fantastic about it. Like I said, this seems to be a bit of a turning time because I'm pretty sure, like, not even 50 years ago, nobody was participating in this. And now it's on fire. The context of Genesis is getting to be a very important conversation. Just like when we take a look at, so we have the where, the what, the where, the when.
Mm.
Mercy, we kind of talked about that really quickly. It's not hard. It's 4,000 to 7,000, depending on who you say. And then between basically 3,000 at the arrival of the empires, the dawn of the empires, to when Jesus comes. And it's the age of empires, the age of nations, which kind of also backs up what we're talking about, which is a book about nation creation.
Mm.
So, nation covenantal creations at the dawning of literature. It's exactly what we see written about. That's the whole story premise is we're the Jew, we're Israel, we're the Hebrews, we're the ones who legitimately have the right to rule. So the whole covenant was created upon rulership and power and authority of that mentality of the time.
How do you expand that? You expand that by creating treaties, by absorbing the smaller nations into the bigger empire. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to build a nation, build an empire. And so how do you do that? You create all these treaties to do that. And even today we have treaties, right? We're doing all kinds of treaties. So this is nothing new, but at that time you're moving away from the hunter and gatherer. You're moving away from the clan and the tribal. You're moving away from all that. And now you have a civilization where you have a whole hierarchy of like scribes and priests, and you have merchants and you have farmers and all of this. And people are trying to figure out, how do we do life? How do we live peaceably together? And then it's like, wait a minute, there's a whole nother group of people over there. Oh, well, we want to absorb them, and that's why in the Bible it talks about beasts and devouring. It's this concept. It's just literature and idioms that they're using of, hey, we want to absorb them in, right? We want to consume them in that regard. So that's the literature, and this is how you do it, building kingdom through a treaty, through a covenant.
And the kingdom empire concept was wild throughout Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was just rank with war and empire domination behind it. It was really a true testament to a time period where, if you want to go look back in time to see what was the evil intent of men's hearts, that's the history. As soon as men got power, they became evil, corrupt, and led nations into destruction and brought ruin and torment to the thousands of people that were under their reign, which brings the interesting image to these covenant nations, which was the we have the perfect way of living. No, we have the perfect way of living. Our king will teach us the perfect. No, it's our king. No, it's our God that's going to rule over your king. Our God. It really goes back to that grade 4 mentality of my dad's stronger than your dad. And then it's fought out in the nation wars about who gets to control which land, who gets to be the one that's served, who's the one that's serving, and power corrupting, which always led to this big giant empire being built and then falling and then repeating and repeating and repeating, and it just kept evolving and changing. New nation would rise after new nation and continue and take on, and we see that pattern of language beginning at the beginning of the Bible. It's the very first thing we read is Adam's kingdom being established and transitioning right out of that into Noah, whose kingdom falls and transitions all the way down to Abraham, who transitions it over to Israel, who kicks Canaan out, who then loses it to Babylon. And that's what it's all about. because that's what the where and the when was. So that's three quick little refreshers. What's the rest here? We got what, where, when, why, and how. How kind of it's the suzerain vassal treaty. So we've kind of been mentioning all of that, kind of summing it up. If you had one important thing for people to constantly have in their mind when it comes to the suzerain vassal treaty, to summarize this quick review, what is the most important thing that you would say when it comes to knowing and understanding the suzerain vassal treaty and how we should apply it to the Bible so that we would never forget that? Like, why? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the what people don't understand is when you're making a treaty, you're making it with the people. That treaty doesn't go outside of the parameters of another clan.
Yeah, good point.
And we have to always keep that in mind because a lot of times, as you know, post evangelical Christians, we like to put ourselves into the text and, oh, it's about me. And we like to do that because we've been trained to do that. That's how, you know, it's been taught and preached to us. But know that when Israel is making a covenant with Yahweh, Yahweh and Israel, it is them that's making that covenant. And we're outside of this story and we're looking into what is happening with that people group. And you always have a head and you always have a body, right? That is very important to always apply to ourselves because we tend to think that, you know, we just replace Israel out and here we are and we're God's people. That's not what the Bible is saying at all. And so we got to remember that.
And when we put into context a little bit of the word play of the word Adam itself, we do see that naturally taking place, which kind of moves us a little bit into the next topic, which is bridging that gap between some of the language. We've got to come to grips with they don't speak the way we do. They don't think the same way we do. We don't even approach the same subjects the same way we do. So how do we do that and how do we break this down? Well, it comes from word usage and all those other areas that we've kind of talked about. But the one we want to I want to bring up today is focusing on how the culture affected the way they looked at things, and not necessarily just always the culture of how were the people, but where they lived and how they lived. So when we take a look at, for example, the culture of the Middle East was surrounded, absolutely taken over by the cycle of the natural seasons. So whatever the seasonal succession was going on, that became a very important time-based system for the people to live by. And in fact, it was so important, it was so powerful that the natural events, this was such a big deal, was every year someone was flooded away, some nation, some tribal event, or a desert was created because the flood didn't come, and people died because of the famine. The dust built up because no water, and all the crops would be destroyed. And this was a very interesting balance. In the north, you'd have the mountains, which would collect and build up moisture. And over the winter, this would build up. And in the spring, it would deluge down and flood the basin. And the people of the time would see this as God's judgment. It's the beginning of a new year, and God's deciding, I'm going to clean the plate. We're getting rid of all the old dead, and we're going to wash it away. And now this flood's coming down, filling the basin. And that's the people living in there. They've got their cities, they've got their towns, they've got their tribes. And one year, the city's just gone from the flood. Next year, you're gone from the flood. So every year that you're not gone from the flood, it's a blessing from God that you made it through. God chose you. You made it through, but God did not choose that town, or that God did not choose that city, or those guys got out lucky. God decided not to take them completely out, but look at the damage they did. I hope they learned to follow God's law. So they had these conversations. They saw every cycle. And then what did they see? Well, every year after the flood, the waters would dry up and then the land was regenerated and the desert bloomed. And you saw, it's called the Fertile Crescent for a reason. And the fertile land would come to life, and they would work the land and try and get as much fruit during that whole period. So, what they were shooting for every spring after destruction would come, or salvation, depending on what side of the flood you were on, yearned most for anything out of all of creation. They yearned for nothing more than the first fruit to appear. and then they would have sustenance. That was the gift from God to sustain them for the whole summer, the whole fall, and even through to the winter to see if they could survive another ride through the flood and come out to another first fruit. So you have the seasonal succession, and a people, regardless of religion, regardless of race, their entire systems are based beyond this because they all went through it. It didn't matter where you lived. This was the natural. In fact, you want to go and look it up? It's still the natural systems of the day to day. Every single empire in the history of Mesopotamia has had to deal with the issues of the flood basin. This is very interesting to us because when we're talking about the language that the people were using at the time was reflective of nature, and they would see God using nature, and that was just normal. So to them, that interaction interestingly became, when we read in the Bible, flood becomes the manner of destruction of all people, regardless of how it comes. If it's a natural flood, it's God judging. If it's not a natural flood, if it's a neighboring nation coming in to wipe you out, it's a flood. It's called a flood by the prophets. And so we see this even all the way up to the time with Jesus announcing the judgment on Israel in AD 70, that it'll be a flood. In fact, the times will be just like the times of Noah. And so this universal flood destruction gets written in. It's not a motif, it's not a metaphor. It was their way of life. They saw a flood come off the mountain and wipe their neighbors out and said, "Thank God it wasn't me." Because next year it could be. Like, that was a real experience. That's real fear. They went through every year dependent on God to give them life. And then not kill them, but afterwards give them the water of life to which all the first fruit springs from. And so that obviously brings to mind a whole bunch of symbolism that we still see being used all the way up until the time of Jesus. And so that's why it's very important. I'm going to hand this over to you, Mercy, because obviously there's so much we can see when we start taking a look at how not only important does uh, we see that motif, but it's not so much a motif as there's a weird foreign, and I mean foreign reality that these people went through that we have no idea, no concepts about, that even today, the people living in that time, technology has freed them from those worries for the most part. Even though they're still devastated, they don't disappear into history anymore because we know and have countries to help us recover these things. So when you think back on the ancient Near East, and we're talking about the times even of the flood, I know you have a cool thing set aside if you want to weave into how the flood is also being used with destruction and what that kind of entails, because I think we all sitting back, that, yeah, they definitely were using nature symbolism in almost every page of the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at climate, weather, and nature, it was they looked at those things that they could not control, they did not understand. It was way more powerful than them. And so, therefore, in Sumer, you have to understand they had over 3,000 gods. So they claimed gods for all of these natural, things, and they attributed to this god or that god or this god. And to have life was to be on the good side of these guys. And so Israel was very different because they were monotheistic, where they were Sumer was polytheistic. Um, but in this cycle, it was a cycle of life, and harvest was very, very, very important. That was how you had life. So when you look at Israel, they had the 7 feasts of Israel. So you had the Passover, and that was a barley grain, right? Then you had Pentecost, that was a wheat grain. Then you had tabernacles at the very end, and that was what? It was wine, right? And you had the wine and the water, and you would celebrate, and you would have libations and all this. And today I was talking with my house church about the depository for the Suzerain Treaty was in the Ark of the Covenant. And at the Feast of Tabernacles, you would bring out the law, and you would then pronounce it to men, women, and children. This is why the Hebrew people, they memorized tons and tons of the whole Torah. You have today, like boys, 7 years old, that's memorized all of Leviticus. So this comes to remind them of who is God, who is your provider, but that there's harvest here. And in those harvests, what you have is 7 months that dovetails. The last month always dovetails in the first of the other month, right? So it's a cycle. It's not linear whatsoever. And when they would do that, they would what? They would blow the trumpet to announce that now we're moving out of this season into this season, and it was a new harvest, and then they prepared for that. And so you see this cycle and creation, nature, weather, climate that determined how they would be what, bountiful or not.
And as we see the destruction side of the flood and the idea that judgment's in a flood, we see it instantly with Adam and Noah. We see how a flood becomes the end of the people of Eden. And what's interesting is all these flood judgments are also met with a horn blast. And that's also interesting because that's the transfer of the new season and the acceptance of the first fruits. And so we see this interesting thing because in our minds, what are we picturing? We're picturing, I guess it depends on where you're coming from, do, 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 do. However, but when we think of holy events and we're like, here's the grand, magical thing, and they're getting all together, what do they reach for? Mercy, you want to show people what the priest would reach for to blow the horn?
Yeah, so he would reach for the shofar. And here I have a real big one here. It's a long one. It's like 3 feet long. And here you have the shofar, and they would blow the horn, right? We have all those scriptural verses of blow the trumpet in Zion, Zion, right? And we would have songs about that. And so this was a big deal of ushering in a whole new season. So I wanted to use this opportunity as we're in the new year to just usher in that new year and bounty and blessing and beauty for everyone that's watching. That's what we wish for you, and that God would just lead and guide us for this year in 2025. So I want to blow the trumpet, and this is a trumpet. It's a shofar. It's not a silver trumpet, and hopefully I can get it in
And
the.
keep in mind, this is what everybody was looking forward to. Yeah, it's not easy. Those are some big lugs.
I did pretty good before this, but yeah, really hard to get in that amateur. But yeah, it would sound something like that.
And you couldn't picture, that it would take a lot of people and a lot of horns blowing to create these big thunderous, and over hundreds, thousands of people that you have to blow these horns over. And then you're celebrating, and we're removed from the reality. Like for 1 second, when they left Israel, or when they left Egypt, what happened? They built a cow. That's what they returned to. They returned to building an animal to worship.
Mhm.
That's the world they were born into. They were born into a world of economic, agricultural, uh, self, human sacrifice, all the sacrificial systems to be indebted to somehow find a way through a sacrifice, paying a way into the gods' graces, into their favor, that the gods would bless them with something. And so a whole world and a whole people coming together, not knowing anything, but all kind of having their own ideas, warred it out and battled it out. And out of that came a people, an Adam, which is interesting because that's the name of the people. I was going to start with this, and now we have that idea of this language, right? We're using, we still see it in the New Testament, right? Like the Romans are the swine, all the enemies are the unclean animals of people. Like they don't make fun of all the doves, right? They're not like, oh, those doves, we hate those doves, all those doves from Syria. No, the enemies were the unclean animals. They didn't. They were very much the same way we are, and the fact that we have, if you were a puppy dog to me last night versus you were a real dog to me last night, even though they're both canines and we're neither one of those, we know exactly what we're talking about. And in the same way, we have that usage throughout the whole Bible, but with that emphasis to how much more important each of these symbols were. So when we're reading Adam, and the word Adam actually is the word uh, earth. So we go back to that land. Where is this all taking place? It's all taking place in Adam. In fact, what's neat about the Hebrew language is when Adam, it says in Genesis 5, and when God had formed Adam from the earth, male and female, and created him, he named him man. Well, you named him Adam. That's the same word. So when God formed Adam from the dust of the Adam, and so we got to understand that it's not actually a foreign concept. A lot of people obviously understood this, especially when we take a look at English, because the word human comes from humus, or which is Latin for earth, yeah, for the dirt.
Well,
And so here we get that same play on words as we get the land. Here, where's my picture? We get the land, the earth, and from the earth rose one of the members of Earth. So from the, which is the Adamah, the feminine version of Adam, from the Adamah, the ground, the earth, rose Adam, and he comes up out. So right from the very beginning, this picture of the one Adam who rose up out of the Adam to rule over them. And so this language is obviously reflective. And if we can put it out there like this, when the when the time period of people, they didn't question whether or not God was real. A lot of people look at Genesis and they're like, this was written to show us this is how God made everything. The people at the time receiving these documents, no one questioned whether God was real. It was the fact that God brought them out of Egypt to put this whole thing together. They knew God was real, but they didn't know was what God demanded of them. And so once we shift our position and understand what was demanded of Adam, and then we start saying these are the better questions, because this is what's going to drive our understanding towards knowing what's being talked about. And so when we take a look at Adam in the beginning, at when we see the language around what's going on with his creation and that same type of language, what do we see? We see that, hey, we who believe God made everything, we believe God made the universe above us with the lights in the sky. We believe God made the great sea. We believe God made all the land. This is how God works. God creates everything like that. Well, if we are going to be a nation created by God, then we must also likewise be described in that same language. If God lives up in the heavens and we represent God, we're the empire of God on the earth, then we must also be represented by language of the heavens to rule and reign. Then there's going to be this working out of this concept. And that's exactly what we see taking place in that usage, even all the way up to the very doubling of that same language when Jesus arrives. What's the very first thing we see on day one? The light appears. What happens when Jesus, I am the light appearing? Where did the light appear? According to Corinthians, it was out of darkness that the light shined. Where was the Genesis 1? And there was darkness on the lake, and God said, let light shine out of it. So we start seeing this duplicating language all the way through the Bible, and it's still being said in the context of creation being applied to the Creator's created people in the same manner. So just as God created great trees, he created great peoples, but he called those great peoples trees. He created nations, and he called those great nations gardens. And all this language we see duplicated. And how can we say that? Well, even Nebuchadnezzar was called a great tree over the whole earth, and he wasn't even a covenantally bound member of the Adam line.
mhm.
So we can see this language. It's not a magical thing. It's just relation. And the relation that the foundation that we can see in scripture taking is the people of the time were relating the way to describe themselves in the same manner as they saw God described as creating everything else. So to them, there was no argument about whether God was real or God wasn't or who created anything. The conversation was, if God created everything, how are we going to duplicate that by when we are created?
Right.
Does that make sense, or do you think that's a stretch, Mercy?
No, would the word motif here, like this is now the nature motif that they're using, the creation motif to bring association that was very a commonality that everyone knew, and now you're bringing that into association with the creation of a nation or a people group, a priestly kingdom. And so
Well,
therefore would have known what they were talking about, but bring like everyone on the same page of legitimacy, like this is right, this is how we do it and how we talk about it.
I would argue that that was the common use of the time. So the people of the land, when they heard uh, the sun, well, they knew that the sun was the greatest symbol of God in existence. How? Because every single day when they woke up, if the sun didn't come up, they knew right away that they were going to have a suffering day. The sun made everything better. The sun was everything to the people. And that was the greatest sign above all. And where was it? Up in the heavens, where man can't go. So now, at the same time, when the sun went away, it was replaced by the moon. But it wasn't as great as the sun. Now, what's different with what the Hebrews were doing, where what was different with the nations that surrounded them, a lot of the nations surrounded them said, so for example, in Babylonian, looks at Nimrod, who becomes the sun god. He becomes the personification of the sun. He himself becomes the sun god. So their worship of these symbols actually interact. They become one with them. Semiramis becomes the moon association, and this is throughout all of the Middle East. They all have associations between the sea is represented by this god, and they, even up to the Greeks. When we got up to the Greeks, you have the same pantheon with different names, and it's Mars is this god, and all this idea of the up in the heavens where the gods live. And so that idea was not in any way abstract. That was just normal. It was common to understand that the gods were in the heavens and the lights represented the positions of power and authority. And it was just common. People understood this.
Mm.
However, when it came to the Hebrews, what was very different was when they said, our Savior, our great leader, our great head is not the Son. But when we look up at the sun and we realize that God created everything and God created the temple of natural creation, and he set the sun at the top of that, that they, as a reflection of that creation, as the nation, their head must also be the sun. But he's not actually the sun, he's the reflection of the place of authority. So just as the moon is a little bit less, as we read, and the sun is the greater and the moon as the lesser. So that's depicted not as persons, but as reflections of authority. And we see that even all the way up to Malachi when he talks about the Messiah coming. And what he said, he says that the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings, the sun of righteousness.
Mm.
And that didn't mean they believed the Messiah was going to be the sun god. Like we're not Shamish, Shamish isn't coming back here. The idea is the most powerful luminary in the heavens, which represented God's servant, God's messenger, the holiest of the highest. So we see the system transition in title for something they actually knew. So it wasn't subjective. The sun is the brightest and the biggest and most prominent symbol of creation.
Mm.
So to them, it wasn't a matter of like their neighbors who were saying, "Oh, I'm actually the sun." They were saying, we recognize God's system and place and rank and file of power and authority. And we, as a reflection of those things, are going to call ourselves by those things.
Right. So when you have heaven and earth, a lot of people, even for us today, we think of it as like a literal term, but it's actually talking, and you say this all the time, that it's actually talking about the authority that God gave. right? Israel, and when they say from as heaven and earth. And it's funny because in the Hittite 80s, there's, they've discovered hundreds and hundreds of them. They talk in the exact same language as the Bible. They talk about the gods from the heaven and the earth, right? And it's this understanding of the authority that they brought out and attributed to themselves because they had to have some kind of authority from the creation and nature. And who would it be? I mean, it's heaven and earth. That's like everything, right? Again, they're very ethnocentric in their worldview and their cosmology. It's all about them. So they're talking in very grandiose language, but it's very specific to their time and their way of life.
Well, we see a transfer also all the way from Genesis, even in the culture of the 1500 years from when this was put together when Jesus, because what was Jesus's claim in the Gospels? He said, "All authority in heaven and earth is given to me," and he was the head of the new kingdom. And Adam was the type in which he was to come and duplicate. So we see that same symbolism because they were carrying on in the same manner, because not only because they liked the language and thought it was cool, but they were mandated to. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't bring to carry forward, is the description in those terms of the heaven represents those who are above ruling and reigning, and the earth being those who are subject. Well, when we get to the New Testament, those terms have to still be used. They are still in place because they're still under that same legal obligation. So that same speaking has to be used to tie up and finish up those same terms. We can't just change language halfway through. If we did, all of a sudden we'd have to rewrite the whole covenant, the whole new law, and figure it out just to update the language, which just isn't going to happen, especially considering when something dies as far as a language, it's actually made better for the law. It's less confusing, no more add-ons to it. So when you have a system already ratified that's already understood, there's no need to change it.
Mm-hmm.
We would need to change it because we don't understand what they're talking about, but to them it was just as simple as copy and paste. They were just copying stuff from Genesis and pasting it over their current time because
Mm-hmm.
they were obligated to. That's why when you read Revelation, the only way you'll ever understand it is if you have a good understanding of the Old Testament, because he's just copying and pasting 80% of it. Why? The same thing we just said. All heaven and earth authority was given. And why heaven and earth? Well, because it's that picture of God, as the scripture says, God rules over all the heaven and the earth. All the heaven and the earth is his throne. It's his authority. That's where he rules and reigns. That's his possession. He's the possessor of heaven and earth. So it's the kingdom of God, which is being bequeathed to someone below. And as Jesus said, or Paul said about Jesus, rather, that they died with Jesus and they were resurrected with Jesus and they were raised up into heavenly places and seated on thrones and ruled and reigned with Christ Jesus. They were in heaven here on earth, because heaven is a place of authority. Now, if we can transition that and realize that that language just is a continuance, it can bridge that gap of our terrible tendency to say, no, we know what heaven means. Heaven means a place that when I die, I get to go off and there'll be roads with gold and I can, plant fields and eat fruit forever. So there becomes a battle of, this is why we have to bring in their culture. We have no concept based on ours, and that original language that they're supplementing in that perception, it's not a code word, it's not anything like that. It's not like when we do it, we're not doing it any different. When Mercy gets dogged on a date, where do we get that from? That's not from the Bible. that's not that's not from any literature until our contemporary times. That's become part of us because of our reflection with nature.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you watch football, or hockey, and a big hit is made. It's like, oh, that guy's built like a tree. That's quoting the Bible. He's built like a tree. That's not abnormal speech. And we've got to stop treating it as such and simply acknowledge that they did the same things but they did it in a much more serious tone. They did so with much more serious intent to let it control their lives forever. And they did so with the intent and the understanding in their mind that they were chosen, picked by God to be representatives of God over all of this entire land as far as the eye can see. To them, it was a bigger and more uh, important thing. And that's why that language is duplicated over and over and over again. And I think that's why we have to put so much attention towards it.
Yeah, and if you're in Bible school or seminary, there's absolutely no class dealing with this kind of biblical language. I mean, students are taught like, okay, you got to know Hebrew, you got to know Greek, but they don't teach you the cultural aspect of language. And I've taught English as a second language and studied linguistics, and that culture, you cannot separate culture from language, and that's what we've done in bibles and Bible schools and seminary. We've done that, and because of that, now we use these words and we put our meaning into it, and that's why we have so many, what, over 45,000 denominations and doctrines and theology. And we really do need, like the work that you're doing is really teaching people, just know this is how they talk, this is Bible language, this is biblical. It's not allegory, it's not like metaphor or these things, like this is how they talk. And that idea is very very hard for people to understand. They think when you say that, like they get it, but it goes right over their heads, and then the next morning when they open up the Bible, they read it just like how they want to read the Bible. It doesn't phase them because they're not trained or taught enough to say, no, this is biblical language, this is how they talk, this is literally that is what we're talking about here. We're not trying to bring something else into this mix, and we got to go to that origin.
When I run in the house, covering my head, going, "Oh my God, it's raining cats and dogs," I mean it's raining cats and dogs. I don't mean that there's animals falling out of the sky. I mean it's raining cats and dogs. And I mean feline. I mean canine. But if you don't know how that word is being used by the culture saying it, that sentence is just crazy. Like, in 3,000 years from now, are people going to be like, these people actually believed at one time animals fell from the sky randomly? You go take it back 3,500 years to Mesopotamia. We said cats and dogs are falling from. Would they go? These people are crazy. Is
Mhm.
it any more crazy because we believe snakes can talk? That donkeys can talk? We don't think that's crazy, but we can think all these other, like, we miss all the commonalities that connect the way we as humans and they and humans interact, and we doctrine out the reality of it.
Mhm.
And that, I think, is the big hit. That's unfortunately our big miss, is the reality of it. And the little that becomes big. The one that I'll pick on to kind of leave off here, put a thought in, is why is the Bible so specific? And this is where one of the King James benefits comes in, is they haven't taken this out. Is why does there be the word seed and offspring?
Mm.
Why isn't seed always offspring? Why is there seed and offspring? And why does the King James make a differentiation between so seed and offspring, or seed and descendants, depending on where you're reading it? And why is there a seed? Why is it that we have no issue in our brain saying that the seed of a man produces fruit from the man? Well, if a seed comes from a man and produces fruit, doesn't that mean a man's a tree?
Mhm.
So why is it easy to say I produce seed and fruit, but I can't say I'm a tree?
Mhm.
Why do we accept three-quarters of it and then run away in fear? Because now it's crazy.
Mhm.
Cats and dogs falling from the sky is crazy. Serpents talking is crazy. But King James keeping the language, I have seed and produce fruit, isn't crazy. And we got to understand why. And we got to understand why that difference is a big difference and why it's a very important difference. In the Bible, where I say my seed, I am not talking about everyone who comes from me. When I say my seed, I'm only talking about the one who will inherit my throne. When I say my children or my descendants, I'm talking about my body, all those who come from me. Jacob loved all of his children, but Jacob only had one firstborn son who was going to inherit it all. And that's the difference. It was the seed of Abraham, as Paul points out, not referring to many, but as in referring to one. Well, go and reread that statement. That statement says, and to his seed and his descendants. Why is there a seed and descendants? You're screwed if you have almost any other interpretation of the Bible, because seed and descendants are put into one word called offspring. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And we need to understand that. Why? Jesus produces fruit. That's a pretty big aspect to the New Testament language. That goes all the way back to Genesis. How do we know? Because it was the seed of Adam, it was the fruit of Adam that was cursed and cut off. These are big concepts, and they're all nature. They're all nature cycle systems, as Mercy was saying. This is a circular system that's happening over and over, generation after generation, season after season, fruit after fruit, seed after seed. This is just the way they talked. We do too. I have a firstborn. I have a first fruit. I have a first seed. We still understand that. All this conversation is about is getting us to realize so did they. And they did so with great intent. Not because they were trying, and I love the question, Mercy. They weren't trying to sit down and say, let's make a metaphor. They weren't trying to sit down and say, let's find out and decide for ourselves what the sun means. All the meanings were already established in their culture. They just decided, hey, look, you see how Babylon says Marduk is the sun, or, Pharaoh is the sun, or whoever is the sun? You know what? The sun is really the symbol of God's ultimate power here on the earth. That's our king. They already had the meanings given to them. They didn't have to go and find it. And they just read it differently. They read the testimony of nature differently than all the surrounding peoples. All the surrounding peoples took all the different aspects of nature as to be controlled by different aspects of different gods. They saw one God who created all these things, which are different aspects of creation that they then can likewise reflect. And so hopefully this puts a lot of thought into where you're coming from. Mercy, I'll give you last word here, because the seed thing's a big deal, to see why some Bibles might help us, some might take away. But at the end of the day, people, you're responsible. If you believe something, it's because that's your choice. And if you're not happy with, waking up going, this guy keeps proving me wrong, or every time I go over to that website, that guy's proving me wrong, or you're responsible for your own choices. And we live and I'll leave it like this and hand it over to you, Mercy, as Paul does. All things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. So just remember that when you make your choices. Not anything, that's one of the primary messages of the Bible. It doesn't matter how you take it or leave it, is nothing prevents you and God from coming together. God is taking care of anything that would ever come between you. The question is, what are you going to do with it? It's up to you now. You can't come up with anything that's keeping you from him. So choose wisely what you're choosing to believe.
That's right. And if I can say to the audience, one big takeaway from this talk and conversation is trying to move people away from, like, I'm reading the Bible literally, or, oh, when I read the New Testament, it's all spiritual language, resurrection, these kinds of terms. It's all talking about spiritually. We want people to read the Bible as is. And when you understand that the umbrella is a Suzerain Vassal Treaty and it's covenant, it's not, I mean, we say, and I've learned this from you, Dallas, it's word usage, but it's really covenant language. That is the Bible. And we need to have people understand that and move away from, well, are you reading the Bible literally, or are you reading the Bible spiritually? Move away from that kind of word usage and talk more of, hey, do you understand that the Bible is covenantal language? Do you know what you're reading when you're reading this in Paul? He's really talking about the covenant system and the words that they use to describe that. That's what's happening. It's not about spiritual or being literal. It's about covenant language. Do you understand that? That will help people a lot from Genesis all the way to Revelation to better understand the Bible.
And what's the point? Because it makes life better. The Bible, if there's one thing that the Bible will definitely bring into your life until you come to one place of rest, is stress. Like, I don't care who you are, it's stressful. Understanding and coming in grips with all this stuff is stressful. It takes a toll on the mind, a toll on the spirit, a toll on the body. Uh, Even those people who walk around with the perfect smiles and the perfect everything's inside are tormented because, let's face it, even with the best news that Christianity presents, at the end of the day, if you do something wrong, you're kicked out. I'm not saying that's the right doctrine, but that's a prevalent thought in Christianity. So Christianity has grown up and fallen into the same trap the Pharisees did, which was, hey, come on, come however you are, because we accept you just no matter what. It's all good. But the moment you come through that door, you're screwed because you got to go through all what they went through. And unfortunately, that's what we've replaced it with. And that's why I think, honestly, this timing is not, coincidental. It's almost as if we as a people have returned back to that pharisaical mindset, and we need a reset. We do need a re-jump. The transition from the Reformation and coming out of slavery was a big deal in the history of the religion of Christianity. And I think we're starting to see so many fruit and blossom as a result of that. And I think what we're seeing is that solving of how we as a people, and not just Christianity, but we as a people, take a look at our culture. Like, there's not one thing that isn't a debate. Like, everything is a debate now. There's
Mhm.
light coming, there's light shining, and hopefully these conversations, and I want to thank Mercy for having them with me, is helping bring some light. And I know it'll bring some stress because it did for me, and I'm sure it has for Mercy. uh, Searching this stuff out, as hard as it is, it's good, it's rewarding, and it's fun. And hopefully this conversation has brought some thoughts, and realize that, look, again, we're not trying to give you all the answers. We're starting the path. We're just trying to get people going. And then hopefully, once we get enough subs and we start getting to a point where we can get into conversations live, I'd love to branch this out. If you feel like you're someone who has ideas in that, I want to say I really appreciate all the comments we've been getting. We really, if there was no one listening, the conversation is pretty boring. We'd still be having it because this stuff's just too cool. But please keep commenting, keep coming back, and hopefully, as we get better and the conversations get, as we move deeper into these, we can hook a whole bunch more people. So thank you for sticking around this long. Mercy, if you want to give us the way out.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Dallas, for your time, and thank you, audience, for following us and listening. And I'm telling you, as you begin to practice, it will get easier and easier for you. So think of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation as a complete treaty that they would have lived by, a covenantal system. And we're trying to get to the Bible, to the base of it and the framework of what was that covenantal system for them, and trying to understand the Bible in that way, because that is what they were trying to do. It was that right there.
And hopefully, these conversations can help make those jumps. And hopefully, we don't look too foolish doing it, because we've gone through probably as many stumbling blocks, if not more, than every conversation with people. I just want to throw this out there because that popped into my head. Lots of people say to me, I'm not anywhere where I need to be having conversation stuff with this yet. None of us are. We're all in this together. I'm from Canada, so there's a guy up here. I'm gonna pull the quote off to end this. When it comes to this game of life, we're all in this together. So we're gonna work together. Keep your sticks on the ice and keep it safe. We're all in this together. Hopefully, we're helping you. We want you to join in. Throw those comments in, and we'll keep this ball going wherever you are. I hope this finds you well. God bless.